Hi everyone and welcome back to English4U. I'm Pat.
And I'm Kat.
And we're on our second part of our article about the YA genre of books. And these started to appear around 100 years ago.
Right. It's not like there weren't books that teenagers could read before that, but specifically books for teenagers started about 100 years ago. So a librarian noticed that children would stop using the library when they hit about the age of 13. I guess maybe they were bored with the picture books, but the adult books were too dry, too long, yeah.
So she had a colleague create a whole collection of books for young adults, and this became the YA, or the New York Public Library YA reading list, which still exists 100 years later.
Yeah, it's being published every year, even now. And so over time, from that 100 years ago until today, or until at least the 1960s, when we talked about yesterday, library collections and books for young adults became more and more common, and you had this golden age of YA fiction.
Yeah, that happened in the 1960s when government funding meant that there were more opportunities for writers. There was a call for a need for people to write these kind of books. And that's where authors like Judy Blume and Lois Duncan published some of their big influential works that are still read today.
Yeah.
And we're going to take a look at some of the stories as well as some of the ideas that you might find in YA books in part 2 of this article. Let's check it out.
Reading.
Teenage books, the rise of young adult literature. Early YA books dealt with coming of age, the experience of developing from a child to an adult. Some topics common in early YA literature were dating, drinking, and drug use, social pressure, and individual identity. S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders, 1967, is considered an important YA book because of its conflict between gangs of different social classes. The 1970s gave rise to many famous Golden Age YA authors. Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, 1970, and Forever, 1975, frankly discussed puberty and sexual topics. Lois Duncan wrote YA books in the horror genre, such as Summer of Fear, 1976. It's about a teenager who thinks her cousin is a witch. By the 1980s and 1990s, YA book series became common. J.K. Rowling's wildly popular Harry Potter books began in 1997, and the characters become more mature throughout the series. This is also true in Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games trilogy and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series in the 2000s. YA books since 2010 have often addressed important social situations like guns, racial inequality, and LGBTQ+ topics. Through YA literature, teenagers can learn more about themselves, their world, and their future.
All right, our article on day 2 starts out by telling us early YA books dealt with coming of age, the experience of developing from a child to an adult. So coming of age is something that every teenager goes through because it's a big shift to go from being a kid to being an adult. There's a lot that happens in between, and the YA books that were written in this early time dealt with that. To deal with something means to be about something or to have that as a subject. So basically saying these YA books were about coming of age, were about growing up.
Yeah, all of the main characters would have been young people going through typical things that young people in the real world face.
Yes.
And we see in the article it says some topics common in early YA literature, and still today I'm sure, were dating, drinking and drug use, social pressure, be like other people, don't be like other people, what's expected, and then the article adds, and individual identity. So these are topics or themes that a lot of YA YA literature was about.
I can think of some YA books that are very, very recent that still deal with these kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the article gives it gives our first example of what might deal with these kinds of themes. S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders, written in 1967, is considered an important YA book because of its conflict between gangs of different social classes. Yeah. Many of my classmates read that one. I didn't myself.
Okay.
But yeah.
But that sentence does contain today's language in focus, so let's take a moment to look into it a little more. So that sentence included the use of because of, and we're focusing today on the uses of because and because of. Both of these are used to provide the reason for something, why it happens. However, they do so in different ways. Because, when it's by itself, modifies the first clause of a sentence and therefore gives the reason for it. It's followed by a whole other clause, like, I was late for work because my alarm didn't wake me up. The second clause gives the reason for the first situation. But if we are giving a noun, noun phrase, or noun clause as the reason, not a full clause, we can use because of. The traffic was bad because of the heavy rain. The heavy rain is a noun phrase, and that is the reason for the traffic being bad. Now, you can also put because of at the start of the sentence. Because of the heavy rain, the traffic was bad. So this book, The Outsiders, was about gangs.
Yeah, gangs are something that a lot of young people have to deal with, especially if they live in cities or very densely populated areas. A gang is a group of young people who do illegal things together and who often fight against other gangs. So you'll see that they have like certain parts of a city, certain neighborhoods are like their territory, and other gangs can't come in there. They might have like gunfights or knife fights or things like that. It causes, a lot of problems in these areas where they exist. So The Outsiders is about gangs and maybe shows some reasons why young people join them, the kind of issues that they cause, and what can happen as a result. So an example sentence, you could say, this part of the city is home to several gangs, so a lot of violent crime happens here.
Okay, so let's move on, and we see the 1970s gave rise to many famous Golden Age YA authors. So from this sentence, we know that Golden Age, which started with the extra funding in the 60s, continued into the 70s. So it was quite a long Golden Age.
Yeah.
And when we use this phrase, give rise to, that's similar to a phrase we used yesterday, bring about. It means to cause something or to see the appearance of something. The 1970s gave rise to, maybe it didn't cause it, the library funding would have caused it, but it certainly happened in the 1970s, and maybe the things that were happening in society, especially in the US at that time, changes and things going on, that caused people to write about certain topics. So it caused those kind of books to appear, and it also saw the appearance of those books.
Yeah, exactly. And so a couple of famous examples the article gives us. Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, written in 1970, and Forever, written in 1975, frankly discussed puberty and sexual topics. So they discuss these issues very frankly. Let's check out that word and learn what it means. Frankly is an adverb that means an honest and direct way. Of course, you can guess by the ly at the end that if you take it off, you get the adjective frank. To be frank means, to be honest, to be direct. It basically means to not hide the truth just because it might not be nice. And so to speak frankly is to not shy away from topics that might be hard to hear about. So periods and sexuality, some people might feel very shy about discussing these things, but these books talk about them frankly. They get it right out in the open and they don't shy away from it. So an example sentence you could say, the teacher spoke frankly about what would happen if we didn't follow the rules.
So one of the changes or one of these topics that's discussed frankly is puberty. And puberty is the changes that happen when a child becomes an adult.
Yeah.
All the things that happen not just to your body but also to your mind. But the body is a big part of it, and periods, as Kat mentioned, hair growing, voice deepening, getting interested in members of the opposite sex, all of those happen in puberty, and that leads to discussions of sexual things.
Yeah, exactly. So sexual is an adjective that means about sex, relating to sex, involving sex. It can be about sexual activities or having sex, people's relationships to each other, if they feel how they feel about their bodies, how their bodies look, being male, being female, being other. Any of those things are sexual topics. So if you're talking about these kinds of things, you might be discussing sexual ideas. So for an example sentence, you could say Rachel feels sexual attraction toward both men and women. Basically, she likes both men and women.
So those are a couple of books by Judy Blume, who we mentioned yesterday. Another author we mentioned yesterday was Lois Duncan. And we see in the next sentence, Lois Duncan wrote YA books in the horror genre, such as Summer of Fear, published 1976. So she was, there are YA books that'll be about romance, about adventures, about growing up, but these ones are in the horror genre.
Yeah.
Horror is the category of books, movies, games, and so on, where the idea is to scare people, to kind of create a feeling of being scared, but in a safe environment, the idea is. And horror movies, of course, often feature ghosts, vampires, crazy killers, lonely houses at night up on hills, that kind of thing. So here's an example sentence. Many horror films are released in movie theaters around Halloween.
Exactly. And horror is just one genre of YA books. So we talked yesterday about categories. Genre is a similar word to category. It is talking about a particular type of literature or art. So you can have categories of almost anything. Like you could have categories of food or technology, but genre talks specifically about things people make. So in literature, you have the horror genre, you have romance, you have fiction and nonfiction. Art has, different genres too. It has like impressionist art or abstract art. Music has genres, pop music, like Pat said, heavy metal, all of those sorts of things. Those are all things that you can call genres. It looks like genre or genre, but it's not. It's genre. It's a French word.
Yeah. So what is this book, Summer of Fear, about? The article says it's about a teenager who thinks her cousin is a witch.
Witch!
Yeah, so a witch, generally this is used for a woman. Not always, but usually.
Sometimes,
mostly. Yeah, generally it's used for a woman who uses magic that's bad. But again, this is not always true. Think of the Wizard of Oz.
Are you a good witch or a bad witch?
Yeah, there are two good witches, two bad witches. They are women, they are used magic, but in some other books, witches can be men. In some other books, they're always bad. In some books, they're good and bad. They're always good. It really does depend on which kind of story you want to read and tell. But by and large, you're kind of thinking witches, old woman, cat, eats children, flies on a broomstick, wears a big pointy black hat.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, it's a horror story. It's about, she's thinking maybe her cousin's doing some bad magic. So this was the golden age of YA. But it's not like YA has, gone away. The article says by the 1980s and 1990s, YA book series became common. So of course, basically it's a whole thing on its own. It's not something, new and interesting, like they're still interesting, but there's not something new anymore. It's just another genre of books. And they came in series. They still come in series. Now, series are sets of books or articles or something like that that have the same group of characters or the same subject. So you mentioned Twilight yesterday. Twilight is a series of, I think there's 4 books, right?
Right.
Yeah, 4 books in that series. Or The Hunger Games or Harry Potter. Those are other series. And there are lots and lots of YA series because there's lots of like fantasy books or big, grand adventures, things like that. And so, yeah, that's a series of books. A series, more generally, is things that come one after the other. So like a TV show can also be called a series. Here's an example sentence. I love this comic book series. The characters in it always have exciting adventures.
Okay, so let's look at some of those series. Of course, we can't really not mention this first one. J.K. Rowling's wildly popular Harry Potter books began in 1997, and the characters become more mature throughout the series. Of course, each one is set during a school year, so they start off in the first grade and they end up in the final grade, and they grow and they get a year older in each book.
Yeah, and here's the funny thing. Harry Potter was the same age as me through all of his books. So when he started school, he was 11, I was 11. And when he finished school, he was 19, I was 19. That was crazy. So that's one series. And then another example, this is also true in Suzanne Collins's The Hunger Games trilogy, just like I mentioned, and Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series in the 2000s.
So what do we mean by trilogy?
Trilogy is a series of always three, novels, movies, and so on, that are closely related and involve the same characters or themes. So Hunger Games is a trilogy because it has 3 books. Tri in trilogy means 3, so it has to be 3 exactly.
Yeah, for some reason that is a popular number for a series of books.
Kind of just works.
Yeah, it's something I might go away and Google and find out about, like why series and trilogies. There are reasons in terms of marketing, but it seems to be a popular number. You don't just write a book, you write a trilogy.
Exactly.
So let's move on in the article. It says, YA books since 2010 have often addressed important social situations like guns, racial inequality, and LGBTQ plus topics. We'll discuss those one by one, but first we need to look at an earlier word in this sentence, address, as a verb. So of course, when we use address or address as a noun, it's the place where you live, your street number, which floor your house is on, which city you live in, and so on. But to address something as a verb means to think about and begin to deal with some kind of issue or problem. Like, okay, our sale numbers are bad at work. Let's address this. We're having some relationship problems. We need to address this. We need to begin to deal with it. We need to think about what's going on and come up with a solution. And this is what these books do. They go, here's a problem, let's address it. Let's look at it maybe from a few different angles. Maybe we won't be able to provide a solution, but at least we can begin to deal with it and think about it. For example, we could say the book addresses the topic of death and how people cope when we lose loved ones. So some of these topics being addressed, we had gun crime and then we had racial inequality.
Yeah, racial is an adjective that means based on or relating to race. So race being like if you are white, Asian, black, Latino, something like that. Basically, you know, how we categorize or put different people into categories based on where they're from in the world. So that's racial. Racial inequality happens in many, many countries. If you are from a race of people that has a smaller group in that country, you might be discriminated against. There might be, you know, unfair treatment of your people. So for an example sentence, you could say, racial topics often come up in our class because there are students of many different backgrounds, basically from many different parts of the world.
So here we're talking about racial inequality. Inequality is a state where things aren't equal and people are treated differently and unfairly due to who they are. It could be inequality between genders, so men getting paid more or treated differently to women. Could be inequalities due to people and who they want to marry or spend their lives with. That's a different kind of inequality. Racial inequality would be treating people differently because of their race, their skin color, etc.
Exactly. exactly. And I can think of The Hate You Give as an example of a YA book about this topic. I can also think of one for this next category, which is LGBTQ+, or you could say LGBTQIA, or any different varieties of this acronym. It stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, and other. That's the plus. It's a catch-all term for people of less common sexual or gender identities. If you don't identify as the sex you were born in, or if you like someone, like if you like people who are not the opposite sex, like most people do, then you might fall under this idea. You might be, what is thought of as queer. Yeah, and so yeah, it's a catch-all for that. And the one I can think of for that, the YA book, is Heartstopper.
Okay, that's another one to check out.
Yeah.
So the article moves on to its conclusion now and says, through YA literature, teenagers can learn more about themselves, their world, and their future. And these books are often good because they can go, hey, I have the same kind of problems as this person. It feels like this book is about me and my situation. And maybe they can learn something, they can feel better because of it.
Yeah, and most of the people who write YA literature have gone through similar things to what they're writing about, and they came out the other side as well-rounded adults. So you can think of this as kind of like, it's lessons for how to grow up. Yeah.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our article, but we're not quite done. Let's go to our For You Chat question.
For You Chat.
All right, our For You Chat question for today. Which YA book has had the most influence on your life and thoughts? Why?
Okay, well, as I said in our introduction back at the start of day one, I read a lot of fantasy, and I have done ever since I was pretty young. Now, some of the fantasy I read, because fantasy also has its own kind of subgenres. There are fantasy books almost for kids, fairy stories and so on.
Yes.
There are fantasy books that are definitely better for adults to read because of what's in them. And there are YA fantasy books where the characters are younger and they go through the same YA growing up experience.
Yeah.
It happens to be in a world with magic, dragons, and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
So you could class The Hobbit as a YA book because the main character goes from being a young innocent to having experience of the world and dealing with different problems.
Yeah.
So if you call that a YA book, that was one of the first fantasy books I read, so of course that's had a big influence on me.
I think Bilbo was kind of older
Well, he was
already.
50, but
yeah, that's not YA.
It's personality rather than...
Yeah, and it's also that the story is so, like, exciting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another example would be the Belgariad series by David Eddings, where the main character starts off as a sort of 12, 13-year-old farm boy who finds out, surprise, he's the chosen one who needs to fight the big evil Dark Lord God and save the world. But on the way, he has to deal with responsibilities, growing up, being put in this situation, love stories, and so on.
Yeah.
I did enjoy those books as a kid. Looking back, I can kind of go, this has still got some nice stuff, but it is a little bit young for me now, but it was certainly interesting to read when I was that age.
Yeah. I think for me, the one that I remember having a big impact on me was Lord of the Flies.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a book about a bunch of kids who their ship crashes on an island and they have to survive together, but they end up basically having a war. And it introduced a lot of ideas about society and about how people have relationships with each other and how it can go wrong.
Yeah.
So it's a very dark book, but I think it's definitely worth reading. If you find Lord of the Flies, give it a shot.
Yeah, the Worst Witch books as well. Jill Murphy, I think, was the author of that, but it's kind of like Harry Potter before Harry Potter with a girl as the main character. But definitely worth checking out.
All right.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Thanks for watching, everybody. For English for You, I'm Pat.
And I'm Kat.
And we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Vocabulary Review. Gang. It's not safe to go to this park at night because gangs often fight each other here. Frankly. The acting teacher frankly told the young man that he would probably never become a working actor. Sexual. Jamie and Morgan care deeply for each other, but they do not have a sexual relationship. Horror. Jill went to see a horror movie, but it scared her and she left the movie theater early. Address. At this afternoon's meeting, we'll address the problems with the department's work and try to solve them. Racial. The school used to have a racial divide. It separated black students from white students until the 1960s.
智慧小补帖
Puberty. Genre. Which. Series. Trilogy.
以上节目是由活用空中美语制作。活用空中美语杂志，请洽询全国各大书店。如欲索取试听教材，请来电02-2364-4000 02-2364-4000，或上网查询，网址是 www.english4u.net www.english4u.net